There is a certain type of emotional experience that feels intoxicating at first. It pulls you in fast, deep, and with intensity that feels almost unreal. The connection feels powerful. The chemistry feels undeniable, and the emotional highs can feel like something rare and special. But over time, something begins to change. The same connection that once felt like passion starts to feel confusing. The closeness becomes distance. The warmth becomes unpredictability, and the emotional clarity you once had slowly turns into emotional uncertainty. This is where many people begin to question themselves. Was it real? Why did it feel so intense but not last? Why do I feel so attached to someone who feels emotionally unavailable? The truth lies in understanding a specific emotional pattern where passion is present, but deep emotional bonding struggles to form. This script explores that emotional contrast, why it happens, and what it reveals about connection, attachment, and emotional safety. At the beginning of this kind of connection, everything feels unusually intense, almost like life has suddenly turned up the volume on emotions you didn't even know were there. The attraction doesn't just build slowly. It arrives fast, strong, and with a kind of emotional electricity that feels impossible to ignore. Conversations feel deeper than normal, silence feels meaningful, and even small interactions can feel loaded with significance. There is a sense of curiosity that keeps pulling you in, as if something important is unfolding and you don't want to miss it. What makes this stage so powerful is not just the presence of connection, but the feeling of emotional contrast. When someone is not fully consistent in emotional presence, your mind becomes more alert. Every moment of attention feels valuable, and every moment of distance feels noticeable. This creates a heightened emotional awareness where you are constantly tuned in, reading signals, analyzing tone, and trying to understand what is happening beneath the surface. The brain naturally responds to unpredictability. When emotional closeness is not steady, it triggers a kind of internal activation. You don't feel relaxed in the connection, you feel engaged. And that engagement often gets mistaken for passion, because in everyday relationships where things are predictable and stable, emotions feel calm. But here, the lack of predictability creates intensity. And intensity is often interpreted as something rare, something special, something meant to be. In these early stages, there can also be moments of deep emotional warmth that feel incredibly real. A conversation might suddenly become intimate, a gesture might feel personal, or a brief moment of vulnerability might create the impression of strong emotional bonding. These moments stand out so strongly because they are not constant. They arrive, they feel powerful, and then they fade again. And it is this rise and fall that keeps emotional attention locked in. The mind starts trying to make sense of the pattern. When something feels good but inconsistent, the natural response is to hold on to the good moments more tightly. You replay conversations, you remember specific words, and you begin to build meaning around small experiences. The emotional highs feel so significant that they overshadow the gaps in between. At the same time, there is often a sense of mystery that adds to the intensity. Emotional distance is not always explained clearly, so the mind fills in the blanks. And when the mind is left to interpret uncertainty, it often creates narratives that feel emotionally compelling. You start believing there is something deeper beneath the surface, something not fully expressed yet, something waiting to unfold. This is where passion begins to form, but not in the traditional sense of mutual emotional building. Instead, it forms through emotional activation. The nervous system becomes engaged, the thoughts become focused on the connection, and emotional attention becomes heightened. It feels like excitement, like anticipation, like something meaningful is developing. But what is actually happening is a blend of emotional uncertainty and intermittent connection. The unpredictability keeps the emotional system active, and that activity is experienced as intensity. And intensity, especially when paired with attraction, can feel like destiny. It can feel like something rare that should not be questioned. However, beneath all of this, there is a key emotional truth. Consistency is what creates emotional safety, not intensity. But in the early stage of this dynamic, intensity is so dominant that it overshadows everything else. The emotional peaks feel so strong that the absence in between is minimized or rationalized. So what begins as attraction slowly turns into emotional engagement, driven by unpredictability. And because the highs feel so powerful, it becomes difficult to distinguish between emotional activation and genuine emotional stability. When emotional closeness is not consistent, the mind doesn't simply let go and move on. Instead, it becomes more active, more alert, and more focused on trying to understand what is happening. This is where emotional distance begins to transform into emotional obsession without the person even realizing it. The absence of clarity creates a psychological gap, and the mind naturally tries to fill that gap with meaning, interpretation, and analysis. At first, it may feel like simple curiosity. You start thinking about why the tone changed, why the response was shorter, why the energy felt different this time compared to before. But over time, this curiosity deepens into something more consuming. You begin to replay interactions in your mind, searching for hidden signals or subtle meanings that could explain the emotional shift. The connection is no longer just something you experience, it becomes something you constantly think about. This happens because uncertainty activates the emotional system more strongly than clarity does. When someone is emotionally available in a steady way, there is no need for mental analysis. You feel secure, so your attention naturally relaxes. But when emotional signals are inconsistent, the brain enters a state of alertness. It starts scanning for patterns, trying to predict what will happen next, trying to regain a sense of control over something that feels unstable. In this state, even small moments of attention become highly significant. A short message, a brief check-in, or a moment of warmth can feel disproportionately meaningful. Not because the connection has deepened, but because emotional deprivation makes any form of reconnection feel amplified. The mind does not evaluate these moments logically, it evaluates them emotionally. And emotionally, relief often feels like intensity. This is where attachment begins to shift from connection to fixation. Instead of simply enjoying someone's presence, the mind starts tracking their absence. You begin to notice patterns of distance more than patterns of closeness. And paradoxically, the less consistent the connection becomes, the more mental space it occupies. What is unpredictable becomes mentally central. Another powerful factor is the way the mind starts constructing stories to explain emotional inconsistency. When someone is not emotionally clear or predictable, your imagination fills in the gaps. You may start thinking they are going through something, or that they care but are afraid, or that the connection is special but complicated. These internal narratives are not based on actual clarity, they are based on the need to reduce emotional discomfort. And as these narratives grow, emotional investment increases. Because now, you are not just attached to what is happening in reality, you are attached to what you believe could be happening beneath the surface. This creates a dual layer of emotional engagement, one with the actual person and one with the imagined potential of the connection. The mind also begins to associate relief with reconnection. When distance creates discomfort, any return of attention brings a sense of emotional easing. This relief feels powerful, and over time it can be mistaken for love or deepening connection. But in reality, it is the nervous system responding to the removal of uncertainty, not necessarily the growth of emotional intimacy. This cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Distance creates tension. Tension increases focus. Focus increases emotional investment, and emotional investment makes reconnection feel even more powerful. The stronger the cycle becomes, the harder it is to step outside of it and see it clearly. Eventually, what started as attraction becomes mental occupation. The connection lives more in thought than in experience. It becomes something you analyze, anticipate, and emotionally react to, rather than something that provides steady emotional grounding. Passion and emotional availability are often mistaken as the same thing in the early stages of attraction, but they come from completely different emotional foundations. Passion can be loud, fast, and consuming. It can create physical chemistry, emotional excitement, and a sense of urgency that makes everything feel important. Emotional availability, on the other hand, is quiet, steady, and consistent. It does not rely on highs and lows to feel real. It builds through presence, reliability, and emotional clarity. In this kind of dynamic, passion is often experienced in strong bursts. One moment there is deep attention, meaningful conversation, or emotional intensity that feels rare and powerful. In that moment, it feels like something significant is forming, something that cannot be easily explained or dismissed. But then, without warning, that emotional presence shifts. The warmth fades, the communication becomes distant, and the emotional energy that once felt so strong becomes less accessible. This contrast is what creates confusion. Because the mind tends to focus on emotional peaks, those intense moments feel like the truth of the connection. The absence in between is often minimized or rationalized. You begin to think the distance is temporary, or that something external is causing it, or that the emotional intensity you experienced is the real foundation of the connection. But in reality, what you are experiencing is not steady emotional availability, it is intermittent emotional engagement. True emotional availability does not leave you guessing. It does not create emotional whiplash where closeness and distance constantly alternate. Instead, it provides a sense of emotional grounding. You know where you stand. You do not have to interpret silence or decode behavior to understand the connection. There is a natural flow that allows emotional safety to develop over time. In contrast, passion without emotional availability creates emotional spikes. These spikes feel powerful because they activate emotional and physical responses simultaneously. The brain interprets these highs as significant bonding moments. But because they are not sustained, they do not develop into stable emotional security. Instead, they remain isolated emotional experiences that stand out because of their intensity, not their consistency. This is where confusion deepens. The mind begins to associate emotional intensity with emotional depth. If something feels strong, it is assumed to be meaningful. But emotional strength in a moment does not automatically translate into emotional stability over time. A single intense experience does not equal a consistent emotional pattern. What makes this even more complex is that emotional inconsistency often increases perception of passion. When someone is not always available, the moments they are present feel more valuable. Attention becomes heightened because it is not constant. This scarcity effect creates emotional amplification. The less frequent the connection, the more intense it can feel when it appears. However, emotional availability is not defined by intensity. It is defined by consistency. It is the ability to remain emotionally present even when things are not exciting or new. It is shown through steady communication, emotional reliability, and the absence of extreme emotional fluctuations. Without this, what feels like passion is often just emotional activation triggered by unpredictability. Over time, this imbalance becomes emotionally draining. The highs feel powerful, but the lows create emotional confusion. The nervous system remains in a cycle of anticipation and disappointment, always waiting for the next moment of connection, but never settling into emotional stability. This is why passion alone is not enough to sustain emotional security. Without availability, passion becomes temporary. It burns bright in moments, but cannot hold emotional structure. And when emotional structure is missing, the experience may feel intense, but it does not feel safe. And without safety, love cannot fully develop in a stable way. The push and pull emotional cycle is one of the most confusing and emotionally draining dynamics a person can experience, especially when they are deeply invested. It does not feel random when you are inside it. Instead, it feels meaningful, like there is a pattern you just need to understand, or a timing issue that will eventually resolve itself. But the reality is that this cycle creates its own emotional rhythm, one that keeps you emotionally engaged without ever giving full stability. In the beginning, the closeness feels powerful. There are moments of attention, warmth, and emotional intensity that create a strong sense of connection. During these moments, everything feels aligned. You may feel seen, valued, and emotionally energized. But just when your nervous system begins to settle into that closeness, something shifts. The emotional presence reduces. The communication slows. The tone changes. And suddenly, you are left in a space of uncertainty again. This shift is not just disappointing, it is activating. Because your emotional system has already registered closeness as something important, the sudden absence creates discomfort. And the mind does not like emotional discomfort without explanation. So instead of letting go, it begins to analyze. What changed? Did I do something wrong? Was that moment real? Is distance temporary or meaningful? This is where the cycle begins to take hold. The discomfort of distance creates emotional tension, and that tension increases mental focus on the connection. You become more aware, more observant, more emotionally tuned in. And just when that tension reaches a certain level, a moment of reconnection appears. A message, a gesture, a return of warmth. And that moment feels powerful, not just because of its content, but because of what it resolves inside you. The reconnection brings relief. And that relief is often mistaken for emotional depth. It feels like something important has been restored, something meaningful has been regained. But what is actually being experienced is the release of emotional tension, not necessarily the growth of stable connection. This relief feels so good that the mind begins to associate the cycle itself with emotional value. Over time, this creates a conditioning effect. Distance creates emotional discomfort. Reconnection creates emotional relief, and the nervous system begins to expect this pattern. Instead of seeking consistency, it starts reacting to fluctuation. Emotional highs become linked to return moments, while emotional lows become part of anticipation. The most confusing part is that both phases feel significant. The distance makes you think something needs to be fixed or understood. The closeness makes you think the connection is real and meaningful. So your mind is constantly switching between emotional states, trying to stabilize something that is designed to remain unstable. This is why leaving such a cycle can feel emotionally difficult. It is not just about attachment to a person, it is also about attachment to the rhythm itself. The unpredictability creates emotional stimulation, and the stimulation creates engagement. Even when the experience is emotionally draining, it can still feel compelling because the nervous system becomes used to the contrast. Another layer to this cycle is the illusion of progress. Each return of closeness can feel like things are improving, like the connection is evolving. But without consistent emotional availability, there is no real progression, only repetition of the same pattern. The highs do not build on each other, they reset and repeat. Eventually, the emotional cost becomes clearer. The mind is not resting. It is constantly interpreting, reacting, and adjusting. The heart is not settling. It is always waiting for the next shift. And what once felt like passion begins to feel like emotional instability disguised as connection. Understanding this cycle is not about blaming or labeling. It is about recognizing how emotional patterns can create strong attachment even in the absence of stability. Because once the cycle is seen clearly, it begins to lose its unconscious power over your emotional state. What makes this kind of emotional experience so difficult to interpret is the constant confusion between what love feels like in moments and what love actually is over time. In healthy emotional development, love brings a sense of clarity. It may not always be easy, but it feels steady in its direction. You know where you stand, even if everything is not perfect. But in this dynamic, emotional signals are inconsistent, and that inconsistency creates a reality where nothing feels fully certain. One moment, there is warmth, attention, and emotional presence that feels deeply meaningful. In those moments, it is easy to believe that something real is forming, something special that cannot be easily defined. The emotional connection feels strong enough to silence doubt. You may feel chosen, understood, or emotionally aligned in a way that feels rare. These experiences create emotional peaks that leave a strong imprint on your memory, but then that emotional clarity begins to fade. Communication changes, emotional energy becomes less accessible, and distance appears without explanation. Suddenly, the sense of certainty that existed moments before disappears. You are left trying to understand what shifted, and more importantly, what it means about the connection itself. This is where confusion begins to take root. The mind does not handle inconsistency well when it is emotionally invested. It tries to create logic out of emotional signals, even when those signals are not consistent enough to form a clear pattern. So instead of accepting uncertainty, the mind starts building interpretations. Maybe they are overwhelmed. Maybe they care but don't know how to show it. Maybe the connection is real but complicated. These thoughts are not random. They are attempts to restore emotional balance. The problem is that confusion starts to feel like depth. When something is emotionally unclear but still emotionally powerful, the mind assumes there must be something significant underneath it. After all, why would something feel so strong if it did not mean something important? This is how emotional intensity gets mistaken for emotional truth. In reality, confusion is not a sign of deeper love. It is often a sign of inconsistent emotional communication. When emotional availability is not steady, your perception of the relationship becomes fragmented. You are not experiencing a continuous emotional connection. You are experiencing separate emotional moments that do not fully connect into a stable picture. This fragmentation forces the mind to work harder. You begin analyzing tone, timing, and behavior, trying to find patterns that explain the emotional shifts. You replay conversations, searching for hidden meaning. You compare moments of closeness with moments of distance, trying to determine which version is real. But both feel real in their own moments, which makes it even harder to form clarity. Over time, emotional confusion can become normalized. Instead of expecting consistency, you begin adapting to uncertainty. You start focusing more on interpreting behavior than experiencing connection. And slowly, emotional awareness shifts from feeling secure to feeling constantly alert. The deeper issue is that emotional inconsistency prevents grounding. Without grounding, the nervous system cannot fully relax into trust. Instead, it remains in a cycle of anticipation and uncertainty, always waiting for the emotional state to shift again. Even the good moments carry a subtle awareness that they may not last. This is why love in this context feels so complicated. It is not that emotions are absent. It is that they are not stable enough to create emotional clarity. The presence of strong feelings does not guarantee emotional coherence. And without coherence, the mind struggles to define what it is actually experiencing. Eventually, what feels like deep emotional complexity is often just unresolved emotional inconsistency. And once this is understood, the confusion begins to lose its authority over how the experience is interpreted. What remains after this kind of emotional experience is not just memory, but awareness. It is a deeper understanding of how easily the human mind can attach itself to intensity, even when intensity is not the same as emotional safety. This realization often comes slowly, not in a single moment of clarity, but through reflection after the emotional noise has settled. In the middle of the experience, everything feels personal. The highs feel meaningful, the distance feels confusing, and the emotional uncertainty feels like something that needs to be solved. But when distance grows and emotional space returns, a different kind of understanding begins to form. You start to see that what felt like a deep emotional bond was actually a combination of strong attraction, intermittent connection, and internal emotional interpretation. One of the most important realizations is that emotional intensity is not the same as emotional stability. Intensity can be created through unpredictability, contrast, and emotional activation. It can feel powerful, even unforgettable. But stability is created through consistency, reliability, and emotional presence over time. Without stability, even the strongest emotional experiences remain fragmented. This understanding often brings a shift in how past experiences are viewed. Moments that once felt like signs of deep connection begin to look different. Not smaller, not less real in feeling, but more accurately understood. They are seen as emotional peaks within an inconsistent pattern rather than evidence of a stable emotional foundation. Another important lesson is recognizing how the mind fills emotional gaps. When communication is unclear or inconsistent, the mind does not remain neutral. It creates meaning. It builds stories to explain behavior. It assigns emotional significance to silence, timing, and brief moments of attention. These interpretations feel real because they are emotionally constructed, not because they are objectively confirmed. Over time, this can create a strong internal narrative that feels deeply personal. The connection is no longer just what is happening externally. It becomes what is being imagined, anticipated, and emotionally processed internally. And this internal layer can become just as powerful as the external experience itself. But when emotional distance finally provides space for reflection, the separation between reality and interpretation becomes clearer. It becomes easier to see that not every emotional reaction was based on truth. Some of it was based on uncertainty. Not every moment of intensity was a sign of emotional depth. Some of it was a response to emotional unpredictability. This realization does not erase what was felt. Instead, it reframes it. The emotions were real, but their source becomes more understandable. The nervous system responded to inconsistency. The mind responded to gaps in clarity. The heart responded to moments of connection that felt rare because they were not consistent. The most valuable lesson that emerges is the difference between being emotionally activated and being emotionally secure. Activation feels intense, engaging, and consuming. It pulls attention, creates longing, and builds anticipation. But security feels calm, steady, and grounded. It does not require constant interpretation or emotional decoding. With this understanding, future emotional experiences begin to shift. There is more awareness of how quickly intensity can form and how easily it can be mistaken for something deeper. There is also more recognition of the importance of consistency over emotional peaks. In the end, the experience becomes less about what was lost and more about what was learned. It teaches that emotional depth is not measured by how strongly something is felt in a moment, but by how safely and steadily it is sustained over time.